January 2006 was supposed to mark a quiet turning point for Rachel Entwistle. At 27, newly married and the mother of a 9-month-old daughter named Lillian, she had crossed the Atlantic from England to Massachusetts, believing she was stepping into stability. The rented house in Hopkinton looked ordinary, even hopeful. It was the kind of place people choose when they imagine routines forming. Mornings with a child, evenings with a partner, plans that stretch forward instead of collapsing inward. For outsiders, it appeared to be a modest new beginning. For Rachel, it was meant to be the foundation of a future she trusted. What no one could see was how fragile that trust already was, or how close it stood to complete annihilation. Less than 10 days after moving in, the house fell silent in the most permanent way possible. In the master bedroom, Rachel and baby Lillian were found lying on the bed, their bodies concealed beneath sheets as if someone had tried to soften the final image or delay discovery. The calm of the room was deceptive. Autopsy results would later confirm that both mother and child had been shot with a small caliber firearm. The brutality of the act was compounded by what was missing. Neil Entwistle, Rachel's husband and Lillian's father, was nowhere to be found. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication of an intruder fleeing into the night. The absence of the man who should have been there turned suspicion into inevitability almost immediately. Hours before police stepped into that bedroom, Neil had already set his escape in motion. He drove to the airport, abandoned the family car, and boarded a plane from Boston to London on a one-way ticket. He did not alert authorities. He did not call for help. He did not contact friends or family to explain what he claimed to have seen. Instead, he crossed an ocean, leaving behind 2 bodies and a growing vacuum of unanswered questions. To investigators, the timing was impossible to ignore. Innocent people do not flee continents after discovering their wife and infant daughter murdered. They call the police. They collapse. They scream. Neil did none of those things. When British authorities confronted him after his arrival, Neil offered a story that sounded rehearsed and hollow. He claimed that on the morning of the killings, he had left the house for a job interview. According to him, when he returned, he found Rachel and Lillian dead. He said he panicked, covered their bodies out of some distorted sense of protection, and fled because he was overwhelmed and considering suicide. It was a narrative built on emotional language, but empty of logic. Investigators listened, documented, and then began dismantling it piece by piece. Physical evidence told a far more coherent story. The murder weapon was identified as a .22 caliber handgun belonging to Rachel's father. On the grip of that gun, forensic analysts found Neil's DNA. On the barrel, they found Rachel's. This alone was devastating to his account, but the contradictions did not stop there. In the car Neil had left behind at the airport, police discovered keys to the home from which the gun had been taken. The implication was clear. Neil had access, opportunity, and control over the weapon used to kill his own family. The narrative of a shocked husband stumbling upon a crime scene could not survive the weight of these findings. As the investigation deepened, motive emerged with chilling clarity. Behind the carefully constructed image Neil presented to the world was a financial collapse spiraling out of control. To friends and relatives, he portrayed himself as a successful entrepreneur, a man with overseas accounts and business ventures on the verge of taking off. In reality, he was unemployed, deeply in debt, and facing increasing scrutiny for fraudulent online transactions. Records showed he owed more than $30,000 and had been using deception to maintain the illusion of prosperity. The life he had promised Rachel was built on lies, and those lies were beginning to close in. Computer searches recovered from Neil's laptop painted an even darker picture. In the days leading up to the murders, he had searched for information about harming others. These were not abstract queries. They were specific, deliberate, and damning. To investigators, they suggested planning rather than panic, intention rather than accident. The image that formed was not of a man overwhelmed by tragedy, but of someone who saw his family as obstacles to an escape he believed he could engineer. Rachel, by contrast, had been isolated and increasingly dependent. Having moved to the United States away from her own support network, She relied heavily on Neil's assurances that everything was under control. Friends later described her as devoted to her child and committed to making the marriage work, even as warning signs accumulated. There was no evidence she posed any threat, no indication of violence on her part. Lillian, 9 months old, was entirely defenseless. The idea that either death could be explained by anything other than deliberate murder collapsed under even minimal scrutiny. Neil's attempt to outrun consequences did not last long. Days after the killings, he was located at a London Underground station and taken into custody. The arrest closed the geographic distance he had tried to create, but it did nothing to reduce the gravity of what awaited him. The process of extradition began, drawing attention on both sides of the Atlantic. In the United States, prosecutors prepared to present a case that would hinge not on speculation, but on a convergence of forensic evidence, financial records, digital history, and behavioral analysis. At trial, the prosecution methodically reconstructed the final days leading up to the murders. Jurors heard about the financial pressure Neil was under, the false persona he maintained, and the imminent collapse of his fabricated success. They learned about the computer searches, the gun, the DNA, and the flight. Each element reinforced the others, forming a narrative that left little room for doubt. The defense attempted to revive Neil's version of events, emphasizing emotional distress and poor decision-making rather than malice. But emotional explanations cannot erase physical evidence, and they cannot explain away a one-way ticket purchased within hours of a double homicide. The verdict was decisive. Neil Entwistle was found guilty of murdering his wife and infant daughter. The sentence reflected the scale of the crime: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. It was a legal acknowledgement that some acts are so profound in their violation of trust that society cannot risk the perpetrator's return. For Rachel's family, the sentence did not offer closure so much as confirmation. There would be no reversal, no reinterpretation that cast doubt on what had been taken from them. Yet even a conviction cannot fully capture the dimensions of this case. The murder of a spouse is often described as a betrayal. The murder of a child is described as unthinkable. Combined, they represent a collapse of the most basic human obligations. Rachel and Lillian were not victims of chance or circumstance. They were victims of a man who prioritized his own escape over their lives, who viewed erasure as a solution to exposure. The house in Hopkinton, meant to be a sanctuary, became the setting for an act of calculated annihilation. In the years since, the case of Rachel and Lillian Entwistle has remained a stark example of how financial desperation, deception, and narcissism can intersect with lethal consequences. It is a reminder that violence does not always announce itself with chaos. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wrapped in domestic normalcy, concealed beneath the language of new beginnings. The sheets that covered Rachel and her baby were not an act of mercy. They were a final attempt to delay accountability, an illusion of order imposed on irrevocable destruction. True crime often invites audiences to search for monsters, to imagine perpetrators as visibly different from ordinary people. Neil Entwistle did not fit that image. He was a husband, a father, a man who spoke convincingly about plans and prospects. That ordinariness is precisely what makes the case unsettling. It forces a confrontation with the idea that the most devastating crimes can be committed not by strangers, but by those trusted most deeply. Rachel's name is now spoken alongside her daughters, inseparable in memory as they were in death. Their story is not one of mystery, but of motive laid bare. A collapsing lie, a fear of exposure, and a decision to eliminate witnesses rather than face failure. The justice system responded with certainty, but the questions that linger are human rather than legal. How many warnings go unnoticed when a life is built on deception? How often does control masquerade as care until it turns lethal? What remains is the reality of 2 lives ended in a room meant for rest, and a man spending the rest of his existence behind bars for choices that cannot be undone. The Hopkinton house was emptied, The evidence cataloged, the case closed. But the silence left behind is permanent. Rachel Entwistle and her daughter Lillian are remembered not only for how they died, but for what their deaths revealed about the cost of lies, the danger of desperation, and the irreversible consequences of choosing self-preservation over humanity.